the annual remembrance ceremony for Korath. Crossing was held every year on the anniversary of the battle. For 15 years, the ceremony had honored an unknown soldier whose identity remained a mystery. This year would be different. Fleet Admiral Myung-jin contacted Ji-won personally 3 weeks before the ceremony. He did not pressure her or make demands. He simply gave her a choice. You can remain anonymous forever. He told her through the secure channel. The official record will continue to list the defender as unknown, and nobody will ever force you to step forward. Ji-won listened in silence. Or you can attend the ceremony as yourself, not as a decorated hero, but as a survivor. And you can meet the people whose lives you saved. What do you want me to do, Admiral? I want you to do whatever brings you peace, Cadet Park. Whatever you choose, I will support you completely. Ji-won spent the next 3 weeks thinking about that. Choice she talked with Orindel, who reminded her that she did not owe anyone anything. She talked with Kethvers, who told her that facing the past was the only way to move beyond it. She talked with Commander Yun Seo, who shared stories about the refugees and how they had rebuilt their lives after escaping Korath 4, and slowly Ji-won realized what she needed to do. She needed to stop running. She needed to face the people she had saved and see for herself that her sacrifice had meant something. She needed to become more than a weapon, more than a legend, more than a ghost haunted by memories of blood and fire. The ceremony was held on Varantos Prime in the great assembly hall that could hold 10,000 people. Representatives came from across the galaxy, including survivors from the original refugee convoy and their children and grandchildren. Ji-won stood backstage and listened to the crowd gathering and felt her heart pounding in her chest. Orindel stood on one side of her and Kethveo stood on the other. You do not have to do this, Orindel reminded her gently. I know, but you are going to do it anyway. Yes, Commander. Yanseo appeared beside them. It is time. Ji-won walked onto the stage and faced 10,000 people who had come to honor a legend. She was not wearing medals or dress uniforms or any of the symbols of military achievement. She wore a simple cadet uniform because that was who she was now, a student learning to become something new. The crowd fell silent as she approached the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces and saw humans and Silvari and Malhiri and Tarvashans, and even a delegation of Raxians wearing the gray sashes of the Reconciliation Council. She took a deep breath and began to speak. 15 years ago, I held a mountain pass against 300 Vraxian soldiers, and I have spent every day since then trying to forget what I did. Her voice was steady but soft. I was 14 years old. My parents were dead, and my colony was burning, and I did not want to survive. I just wanted to stop the people who had taken everything from me. She paused and looked at her hands. I was not brave. I was terrified the entire time, and between firefights, I hid in the darkness and cried for my mother who would never answer. A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. I killed 112 people that night, and I carry every single one of them with me. And for 15 years, I have wondered if what I did was worth the cost. She looked up and met the eyes of the crowd. But today, I am looking at the faces of people who survived because of what happened in that pass. And I am seeing children who were born because their parents escaped. And I am realizing that maybe the cost was worth paying after all. Tears were flowing down faces throughout the assembly. I do not want medals or statues or songs about my bravery. I want you to know that the girl who held that pass was scared and hurt and broken. And she would have given anything to have someone else take her place. She straightened her shoulders. But there was no one else, and so she did what needed to be done. And if she could speak to you now, she would say that the real heroes are the medics who saved her afterward, and the commanders who gave her purpose, and the refugees who rebuilt their lives despite everything. Movement caught her eye, and she saw Kethveo Har walking onto the stage. He was wearing the formal robes of the Vraxian Reconciliation Council, and his scales had been painted with the traditional marks of contrition. He stopped beside her and turned to face the crowd. I speak for the Vraxian people," he said, and his voice carried across the silent assembly. "We acknowledge the atrocities committed at Korath, and we accept responsibility for the suffering our ancestors caused." He turned to face G1 directly, and we offer our formal apology not to humanity as a whole, but to Park Gi-won specifically, because she deserves to hear those words from those who wronged her. He dropped to his knees and lowered his head. "We are sorry." G1 looked down at the Vraxian kneeling before her and felt something release in her chest, something she had been holding on to for 15 years. She reached down and took his hand and pulled him to his feet. "I accept your apology," she said quietly, "and I hope that together we can build something better than the world that made us enemies." The crowd erupted in applause that shook the walls of the assembly hall. 6 months later, G1 graduated from the academy. She was not the top of her class, but she had completed every requirement and earned her place among her peers. Her assignment was exactly what she had requested. She would be training other survivors of trauma, helping them find purpose in service without losing themselves to the darkness. On her last day at the academy, she stood before a class of new cadets and looked at their young, eager faces. A Vraxian cadet raised his hand. "Commander Park, is it true that you were the defender of Karth Crossing?" Juan smiled. "Let me tell you what really happened that day," she said. "Not the legend, but the truth." And she began to teach them that heroism was not about glory or strength or the absence of fear. It was about choosing to protect others, even when you had nothing left to give. It was about surviving long enough to become something more than your worst moments. It was about finding the courage to stop running and finally stand still. The secret did not stay secret for long. Within a week, the entire academy knew that Cadet Park Ji-won was the legendary defender of Korath Crossing. Nobody knew exactly how the information spread, but rumors moved through the station like fire through dry grass. Ji-won felt the change immediately. Human cadets who had barely acknowledged her before now stared at her with something like worship in their eyes. They whispered to each other when she passed and fell silent when she entered a room. Alien cadets reacted differently. Some looked at her with new fear, as if they expected her to attack them at any moment. Others seemed fascinated in a clinical way, like she was a dangerous animal that had somehow been trained to sit in classrooms. Tovashian cadet Desik, who had been so skeptical during the original lecture, approached her in the dining hall. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "I called your actions impossible, and I was wrong." One looked at him without expression. "You were not wrong. What I did should have been impossible, and yet you did it. I did not have a choice." Desik considered this for a choice moment and then performed a formal Torvashian bow of respect before walking away. Ji-won pushed her food around her plate and wished everyone would simply leave her alone. That evening, the Melhiri delegation requested a meeting with her. They wanted to interview her about the battle so they could update their probability models for human combat effectiveness. "We have calculated that your survival odds were approximately 0.003%. The lead Melhiri explained with obvious confusion. "Our models cannot account for what you accomplished. Your models are wrong," G1 said flatly. "Clearly, but we do not understand how they are wrong. You assume that survival matters," G1 told them. "A soldier who does not care whether they live or die cannot be predicted by your mathematics." The Melhiri exchanged glances and made notes and left without understanding anything at all. Over the following days, G1 found herself increasingly isolated. The attention was suffocating, and the constant stares and whispers made her feel like she was back in that mountain pass, surrounded by enemies on all sides. She stopped attending classes. She stopped eating in the dining hall. She stayed in her quarters and stared at the ceiling and felt herself slipping backward into the darkness. She had fought so hard to escape. Urindel refused to let her fall. The Selvari came to their shared room every night and sat beside G1's bed and talked About nothing important, she told stories about her homeworld and described the bioluminescent forests where she had grown up. She did not ask questions or demand explanations. She simply remained present and refused to abandon her. Frank Itvire helped. In his own way, he confronted the other cadets who were treating G1 like a museum exhibit. She is not a legend, he told a group of human cadets who had been following her through the corridors. She is a person who did an extraordinary thing under impossible circumstances, and she deserves to be treated with dignity, not curiosity. When the Vraxian delegation suggested using G1's story for diplomatic purposes, HFY War shut them down immediately. You do not get to profit from her suffering, he told his own people. Not after what we did to cause it. Commander Yoon Seo faced pressure of her own. The Admiralty wanted to bring G1 forward as a symbol of human resilience and courage. They wanted to give her medals and make speeches and turn her into a recruitment tool. Yoon Seo refused. She was a child who should have been protected. She told Admiral Myung Jin directly, "We failed her once and I will not let us fail her again. She could inspire millions. She is not a symbol. She is a traumatized young woman who deserves the right to heal in peace." The Admiral was silent. For a long moment, "You are risking your career, Commander. Some things matter more than careers." In the end, the Admiralty backed down. Perhaps they respected Yoon Seo's conviction, or perhaps they simply decided the controversy was not worth the trouble either. Wei Ji-1 was left alone, at least for now. A month after the secret spread, Yoon Seo delivered a second lecture to the Academy. This time she did not speak about tactics or terrain or military history. She spoke about the cost of legends. We tell stories about heroes because we want to believe that extraordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. She said to the assembled cadets, "But we forget that those heroes are still people, and the things that make them extraordinary often come from the worst moments of their lives." She paused and looked around the room. The defender of Karth Crossing did not choose to become a legend. She chose to protect innocent people at any cost to herself, and that cost was higher than any of us can imagine. Ji-1 sat in the back row and listened with tears running silently down her face. The 12,000 refugees who escaped that day did not celebrate a victory. Yoon Seo continued, "They mourned a child who gave up her future so they could have one. And when we turn her into a legend, we erase the suffering that made her sacrifice possible." She ended the lecture with a simple request. Treat each other with kindness. You never know what battle someone else has already fought. That night, Ji-1 found Urindel and Kethver waiting for her in the meditation garden. They sat together beside the artificial stream and watched the water flow over the stones. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, Ji-1 broke the silence. "I think I want to stay," she said quietly. "I was ready to leave, but I think I want to stay and finish what I started." Orendel's patches glowed warmly. "We are glad." Kethville nodded. "You belong here as much as anyone." Ji-1 looked at her unlikely friends and felt something she had not felt in 15 years. She felt hope. Commander Yoon Seo found Ji-1 in the training hall 3 days after the lecture. Young Cadet was running combat drills against holographic opponents, and her movements were fluid and brutal and efficient. Seo watched for several minutes before stepping forward. Computer and simulation. The holographic enemies vanished, and Ji-1 spun around with sweat dripping down her face. "Commander, walk with me, Cadet Park." It was not a request. They walked in silence through the station corridors until they reached a private meditation garden reserved for senior officers. Yoon Seo sealed the door behind them and gestured to a bench near a small artificial stream. "Sit." Ji-1 sat. Her posture was rigid, and her hands were clenched into fists on her. Yoon Seo sat beside her and looked at the water flowing over smooth stones. 15 years ago, I was stationed at the refugee camp on the other side of that mountain," she said quietly. "I was a young lieutenant assigned to coordinate evacuations, and I had my daughter with me because the colonies were supposed to be safe. G1's breathing had become shallow. When the Vraxians attacked, we thought we were all going to die. And the only thing standing between 300 shock troops and 12,000 terrified civilians was a mountain pass that nobody could defend. She turned to look at G1, but someone did defend it, and my daughter is alive today because of what that person did. G1's eyes were wet, but she refused to let the tears fall. Commander, I do not know what you think you know, but I'm not asking you to confirm anything. Yunseo interrupted gently. I am telling you that I owe my daughter's life to whoever held that pass. And if that person is sitting next to me right now, then I need her to know that her sacrifice meant something. The silence stretched between them. The artificial stream made soft sounds that should have been soothing, but felt instead like the rush of blood in G1's ears. And then something inside her finally broke. I was 14. She whispered. Yunseo did not move, did not speak, did not breathe. My parents were killed in the first wave of attacks, and I was trying to escape with the other refugees when I found a dead soldier near the pass entrance. G1's voice was flat and empty, like she was reading from a report. He had a rifle and ammunition, and I knew the Vraxians were coming, so I took his equipment and I climbed up into the rocks. She looked down at her scarred hands. I was not brave, Commander. I was already dead inside, and I simply refused to stop shooting. Yunseo reached out and placed her hand over G1's clenched fist. That sounds like bravery to me. It was not. Ji-Yurin said with sudden intensity. I was terrified the entire time. And between firefights, I hid in the darkness and cried and called for my mother, who would never answer. The tears finally fell streaming down her cheeks. I killed them because I did not know how to do anything else. And I kept killing them because every time I stopped, I could hear the refugees moving through the pass behind me, and I knew that if I let even one Vraxian through, they would all die. Her whole body was shaking now. I took wounds that should have killed me, but I kept moving, because dying felt easier than living with what I had already done. Yunseo pulled the younger woman into an embrace and held her while she sobbed. Neither of them noticed the figure standing in the shadows near the sealed door. HFY War had followed them. He had suspected the truth for days, and now he had confirmation. The demon that had killed his grandfather was not a demon at all. It was a child, a 14-year-old girl, who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. He stood frozen as the weight of that revelation pressed down on him. His grandfather and his entire regiment had been stopped, not by a trained special forces operative, but by a grieving child with a stolen rifle. The shame of what his people had done at Karth 4 had always been abstract. Now it felt personal and immediate and unbearable. He stepped forward into the light. Both women looked up, and G1's face went pale with horror. How much did you hear? She demanded. Enough. HFY replied. He walked toward them slowly, and then did something that neither woman expected. He dropped to his knees and lowered his head, exposing the vulnerable scales at the back of his neck. In Vraxian culture, this was the deepest gesture of submission and acknowledgement. It meant that he recognized a debt that could never be repaid. I do not ask for your forgiveness, HFY War said to the ground. What my people did to your colonies was unforgivable, and what they tried to do to those refugees was worse. He raised his eyes to meet G1's. But I want you to know that my family has carried shame for 3 generations because of Karth crossing. And now I understand why. G1 stared at him with an expression that was impossible to read. Your grandfather tried to murder 12,000 innocent people. Yes, and you want me to feel sorry for your family's shame? No, HFY War said firmly. I want you to know that some of us understand what we did wrong. And I want you to know that what you did that night was not the act of a demon or a monster. He reached up and touched the scales at his throat. It was the act of someone protecting the innocent from those who would harm them. And there is no dishonor in that. G1 said nothing for a long moment. Then slowly she extended her hand toward him. He took it, and she pulled him to his feet. "My name is Park G1," she said quietly, "and 15 years ago I killed 112 of your people to save 12,000 of mine." Kethvire gripped her hand firmly. "My name is Kethvire of Clan Desic, and my grandfather was among those 112. They stood there, holding hands across a divide of species and history and blood. It was not forgiveness, it was not absolution, but it was a beginning. G1 stood at the observation deck and watched the stars spin slowly past the station windows. Varanthos Prime rotated once every 6 hours, which meant the view changed constantly like a slow dream that never ended. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and tried to breathe. The memories came anyway. Mountain pass filled with smoke and the smell of burning vegetation. Weight of a rifle that was too big for her small hands. A child screaming somewhere behind her calling for a mother who would never, and G1 squeezed her eyes shut, but the images only grew sharper. She remembered the cold of that first night when she had hidden among the rocks and waited for the Vraxians to come. She remembered the terror that had paralyzed her until a worse fear took over. The fear of what would happen to the refugees if she did not act. Cadet Park. The voice made her spin around with her hand reaching instinctively for a weapon that was not there. HFY stood several meters away, with his hands raised in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. His gray scales caught the starlight and made him look like he was carved from stone. "I did not mean to startle you," he said carefully. G1 forced her hand back to her side. "What do you want?" "I want to talk about Korath Crossing." Something flickered across G1's face before she controlled it, fear or anger or perhaps both. "I have nothing to say about that battle." "I think you do," Kethvor replied. "I watched you during the lecture, and I saw how you reacted to the footage, and I need to understand what happened there." G1's expression hardened. "Your people murdered 60,000 civilians. That is what happened there." "I know," Kethvor said, and his voice carried genuine pain. "My grandfather was among the soldiers who died in that pass, and my family has carried the weight of what happened for 3 generations." G1 said nothing, but she did not walk away. His final transmission spoke of a demon in human skin. Kethvor continued. "He said they could not kill it no matter how many times they shot it down, and he said it kept rising and kept fighting until the very end. Perhaps your grandfather was simply a poor soldier." The words were cruel, and G1 knew it, but she needed him to leave. She needed everyone to leave her alone with memories she had spent 15 years trying to forget. Kethvor absorbed the insult without visible reaction. "My grandfather was many things, but he was not a poor soldier. And whatever killed him was something extraordinary." He took a step closer. "I am not here to accuse you of anything, Cadet Park. I am here because I need to understand, and I believe you can help me." G1 turned back to the window. "You are mistaken." She did not answer. Kethvor stood in silence for a long moment, and then he turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridor until they faded to nothing. G1 remained at the window and watched her reflection stare back at her. Face looking back was 29 years old, but the eyes belonged to someone much younger, someone who had seen too much too soon. 3 levels below Commander. Yunseo sat in her office and stared at her terminal screen. Cadet Park G1 service record filled the display, but most of the entries were marked classified. The gaps were enormous according to the file. G1 had enlisted at age 14, which was technically illegal, but exceptions were sometimes made during wartime. Her training records showed exceptional performance in combat simulations and survival exercises. Her psychological evaluations were sealed at the highest security level. "What are you hiding?" Yunseo murmured to herself. She submitted a formal request for the complete file and waited. The response came within minutes, which was unusual. Most Classified record requests took days or even weeks to process. The message was brief and came directly from Fleet Admiral Myung-jin himself. "Leave it alone, Commander. Some heroes do not want to be found." Yuseo read the message 3 times. Admiral had not denied that G1 was connected to Korath Crossing. He had simply warned her away. That was answer enough. In her shared quarters, G1 sat on the edge of her bed while Urindel watched with worried eyes. The Salvary's bioluminescent patches pulsed in soft patterns that indicated concern and empathy. "You do not have to tell me anything," Urindel said gently, "but I'm here if you need to speak." G1 looked at her roommate and felt something crack inside her chest. She had spent so long keeping everyone at a distance. She had built walls so high and thick that nothing could get through. But Urindel had been patient and kind for 3 years, and perhaps she deserved some small piece of truth. "I joined the military when I was 14, G1 said quietly. "My colony was destroyed, and I had nowhere else to go." Urindel's patches flickered with sadness. "That is very young to become a soldier." "I did not feel young," G1 replied. "I felt empty, like everything inside me had been burned away, and there was nothing left but anger and the need to do something, anything to make the pain stop." She looked down at her hands. There was a scar on her left palm that she had gotten 15 years ago when a piece of shrapnel had torn through her glove. "I made choices during the war that I cannot take back, and I did things that still visit me in my dreams." Urindel moved closer and placed one slender hand on G1's shoulder. "Whatever you did, you survived. And that means you have the chance to become something more than your past." G1 wanted to believe that she wanted to believe that the girl who had killed over 100 Vraxians in a single night could become something other than a weapon, but the memories were always there waiting in the darkness. And now, after 15 years of silence, people were starting to ask questions. Commander Yunseo was investigating her file. HFY was watching her with knowing eyes. The legend of Korath Crossing was no longer just a story in a history book. It was closing in around her like a trap she could not escape. AG1 looked at the stars through her small window and wondered how much longer she could keep running from the truth. The lecture hall fell silent as Commander Yunseo activated the holographic display at the center of the room. 47 cadets from 12 different species sat in curved rows that climbed toward the ceiling like steps in an ancient amphitheater. The lights dimmed and a planet appeared above them, spinning slowly in the artificial darkness. "Korath 4, Yunseo said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. 15 years ago, this world was home to 4 human colonies and approximately 60,000 civilians." She touched a control panel and red markers appeared across the planet's surface. The Vraxian Dominion invaded without warning or declaration of war, and within 72 hours, they had destroyed 3 of the 4 colonies completely. A Torvashian cadet in the front row made a clicking sound with his mandibles that indicated skepticism. Yunseo ignored him and continued. "The survivors from all 4 colonies, roughly 12,000 people, fled toward the only evacuation point on the continent, a small valley called Shepherd's Rest, where transport ships could land safely." The hologram zoomed in to show a mountain range with a single narrow pass cutting through it. But to reach that valley, they had to cross through Korath Crossing, a passage barely wide enough for 20 people to walk side by side. She paused and looked around the room. The Vraxian pursuit force numbered 300 shock troops, their fastest and most brutal warriors designed specifically for hunting and eliminating fleeing populations. In the back row, a human cadet named G1 sat perfectly still with her hands folded on her desk. Her face showed no expression at all, but beneath the desk, her right leg had begun to shake. What happened next? Yunseo continued. Has become one of the most studied and debated military engagements in galactic history. The hologram shifted to show grainy footage captured from a helmet camera. The image shook violently, and the sound of weapons. Fire crackled. Through the speakers, a figure could be seen moving between rocks on a mountainside, but the quality was too poor to make out any details. A single soldier held that pass for 19 hours against the entire Vraxian force. The Torvashian cadet made his clicking sound again. Louder this time. Impossible, he said. One soldier against 300 trained warriors cannot survive for 19 minutes, let alone 19 hours. Yunseo smiled without warmth. I did not say the soldiers survived. Cadet Desic, I said they held the pass. She brought up a tactical display showing the terrain. The pass is narrow with high walls on both sides and numerous rock formations that provide excellent cover. And a clever defender who knows how to use the terrain can force attackers to approach only a few at a time. A Malhiri cadet raised one of her forearms. Commander, even accounting for terrain advantages, the mathematics remain problematic. A single combatant would exhaust ammunition supplies and suffer accumulated injuries. That would render continued resistance statistically impossible. You are correct, Yunseo said, and yet the evidence is undeniable. She gestured, and more footage appeared, this time from multiple sources. These recordings come from Vraxian helmet cameras recovered after the battle, and they show the same defender appearing in different positions over the full 19 hours. The images were haunting flashes of a small figure darting between cover. Muzzle flashes in the darkness. Bodies of Vraxian soldiers falling one after another. The Vraxians lost 112 soldiers confirmed dead, with another 63 wounded severely enough to require evacuation. And by the time they finally pushed through the pass, the refugee convoy had reached Shepherd's Rest and the transport ships had departed. Silence filled the room. Even the skeptical Torvashian had stopped his clicking. The defender was never identified. Yunseo said softly, no body was recovered and no one came forward to claim responsibility for the action. And to this day, we do not know who held Karth Crossing. A Vraxian cadet named HFY shifted uncomfortably in his seat 3 rows. From the front, his scales had turned a darker shade of gray, which indicated distress among his species. His grandfather had served in that pursuit force and had been among the dead. Some believe it was a special operations soldier who was extracted secretly after the battle. Yunseo continued. Others think it was a civilian who took up arms and died in the final assault, their body buried under rockfall from Vraxian explosives. She deactivated the hologram and the lights returned to normal. What we do know is that 12,000 people survived, because one person decided that the Vraxian advance would stop at that pass. G1's hands had begun to tremble. She pressed them flat against the desk to hide the shaking. But her roommate Orindel noticed the Solvari. Female leaned closer with concern, evident in the way her bioluminescent patches flickered. Are you unwell? Orindel whispered. I am fine. G1 replied, but her voice came out thin and strained at the front of the room. Yunseo was assigning research projects related to the battle. I want each of you to analyze the tactical decisions made at Karth Crossing and explain what you would have done differently in the defender's position. G1 stood up suddenly, and every eye in the room turned toward her. Commander, she said, I request permission to be excused. Yuso studied the young cadet with interest. G1 was 29 years old according to her file, but something about her eyes made her seem much older. Are you unwell, Cadet Park? I need air. G1 said simply. Yunseo nodded slowly. Permission granted, but I expect your analysis on my desk by tomorrow morning. G1 gathered her materials and walked toward the exit with careful, controlled steps. She did not run, although every part of her wanted to. She did not look at the other cadets, although she could feel their stares. She simply walked until she reached the door, and then she was gone. HFY War with narrowed eyes. He had noticed her reaction to the footage, and the way her hands had trembled when the weapon's fire played through the speakers. He had spent his entire life studying that battle, trying to understand what had killed his grandfather and so many others of his clan. Something about Cadet Park felt familiar in a way he could not explain. At her podium, Yunseo also watched the door close behind Ji-won. Had taught at this academy for 11 years and had learned to recognize trauma when she saw it. The young woman was carrying something heavy, and the lecture had clearly disturbed her, and so made a mental note to review Cadet Park's service record more carefully. There were answers hiding somewhere in those files, and she intended to find them. Lecture continued, but something had shifted. In the room, the legend of Korath Crossing had always felt distant and abstract, like something from ancient history. But the look on Ji-won's face had made it feel suddenly and terribly real. Outside in the corridor, Ji-won leaned against a wall and pressed her palms against her eyes. The sounds would not stop playing in her head. Weapons, fire and screaming, and the terrible silence that came afterward. She had thought she was past this. She had thought 15 years was enough time to bury the memories so deep they could never surface again. She had been wrong.